If you drove 40 minutes from the Olympic stage in Nagano, you'd come across this strange memorial. There's nothing like it anywhere else in Japan. It may not mean much to the sports fans gathering all around here, but an American Olympian of another time came here once and left a part of himself on this ground. You've probably never heard of him, but this is the incredible story of his life.
This is your life. Now, the life we are about to relive is an American saga of courage and stamina that perhaps has no equal in the annals of sports or war, from the heroes of ancient Greece to our own day. For tonight, ladies and gentlemen, this is your life, Louis Zamperini. Louis Zamperini.
Louis Zamperini never seemed destined for fame. Anyone who knew him as a kid thought he'd be more likely to wind up in trouble than on television.
Louis was a pain in the neck. In the old days, we only had one police car in town. So if it went south, Louis went north. I started getting in trouble because of the kids liked to hear me swear in Italian, so they were always picking on me to hear me swear in Italian.
He was the son of Italian immigrants, and this was Torrance, California, a tough neighborhood outside Los Angeles. Louis never signed up for a class he couldn't skip, never saw a freight train he couldn't hop.
I started, by the way, when I was 5 years old.
Torrance's police chief, Jerry Calder, knew him as a kid who was so fast on his feet that he managed to steal beer from bootleggers. It was Calder and older brother Pete who tried to convince Louis to run in another direction.
The first race Lou got in, he won and heard his name. All the guys yelled, "Come on, Lou, come on." And I guess that turned him, because it was from there on out. He had a different outlook on life.
Losing was not for Louis. He became the sensation of Torrance High School. In May 1934, at the high school state finals, he unleashed the devastating kick that was becoming his trademark and set a new world record for the high school mile.
He had an interview, and it wasn't 30 seconds after he finished the race, and he wasn't breathing. He was uncanny.
Uncanny? The second time he ran 5,000 meters, he qualified for the U.S. Olympic trials in New York City. It was July, 1 month before the 1936 Olympics in Berlin.
The city dads, when they gave me my suitcase, they had painted on the outside the Torrance Tornado. And I was embarrassed. I finally got a roll of adhesive tape, and I put it over the Torrance Tornado. I didn't want to get on the train with all these great athletes, and a little punk high school kid comes in there with Torrance Tornado.
For the first half of the race, the punk high school kid was looking at the back of world record holder Don Lash. Then, Zamperini pulled up right next to him and stayed there. The two ran stride for stride the final 100 meters. They hit the tape together, tying for first. Louis Zamperini had made the U.S. Olympic team. He was 19 years old. Torrance celebrated its first Olympian. Even the cops were cheering. The boy they thought would wind up in jail was going to Germany instead, to the Berlin Olympics of Jesse Owens and Adolf Hitler. New challenge, new country, new cops.
Louis was the guy who was the fun-loving guy, the rascal. He saw on a flagpole a German flag, the Nazi emblem, the swastika, and he wanted a souvenir for himself. So he shinnied up with his pole, maybe 50 feet in height, and slid down into the arms of the Gestapo.
And then I just inadvertently decided to run. Probably the stupidest thing I could have done, but then of course I'm a runner. I started to run, and I heard, I believe, a shot. I heard something crack. Then I heard the words, "halt and see, halt and see."
This time, the wily runner decided to halt. But Zamperini got to keep that flag. Then he hit the track. In front of 100,000 people, he started the 5,000-meter final, hoping to keep the front runners within safe distance before going for broke. But his lack of experience showed through. With one lap to go, Zamperini was hopelessly behind. Zamperini ran his last lap here in Berlin's Olympic Stadium in a staggering 56 seconds. He finished 8th, ahead of the other Americans, and was congratulated on his closing kick by none other than Adolf Hitler. Zamperini was happy enough with his performance, but saw it as a warm-up. He left Berlin confident that his golden moment was 4 years away at the Tokyo Olympics of 1940, the games which were never held. The Olympics were replaced by a war. Zamperini signed up for bombardier training in Texas. With the rank of second lieutenant, he was posted to Hawaii, where he flew and ran, where he took flak and kept training. Any track would do. Zamperini was taking off. That meant here at Kahuku Air Base. Yep, this was an air base back then, one of the busiest in the Pacific. On May 26, 1943, Zamperini ran a mile in 4 minutes and 12 seconds here. Hours later, his crew got a call to go out on a rescue mission, and after that, nothing would ever be the same. The only plane available was the Green Hornet, a relic which had been stripped of its parts to service other planes. The pilot, Russell Phillips, was told the Green Hornet had passed inspection. Phillips, Zamperini, and 10 other crew members loaded it up and took off to search for a missing B-25 200 miles north of the island of Palmyra. The Green Hornet headed south to the point where the B-25 had last been heard from, flying at 1,000 feet as the crew scanned the water below for survivors.
As we circled to look for debris in the water, our number one engine, the RPMs dropped. This plane was barely flying with 4 motors, and with 2 gone, it just dropped like a rock. The plane exploded. I felt like someone hit me in the forehead with a sledgehammer. My head comes out of the water. It looks just like the world has just stood still for a moment. The plane was completely blown apart, and I could see the pilot, Russell A. Phillips, and McNamara.
Of the crew of 12, only Zamperini, Phillips, and Francis McNamara, the tail gunner, were alive. Zamperini spotted a life raft floating rapidly away from the burning waters. He swam to it, then returned to scoop up Phillips and McNamara.
Yeah, I was glad to see anybody that was moving, and there weren't very many of them.
The tail gunner, within the first half hour, he was screaming, "We're all going to die, we're all going to die."
He may have been screaming, but it was not an unrealistic assessment. They were alone in a raft somewhere in the Central Pacific. No one knew they were alive, and it probably didn't make much difference. They seemed destined to disappear without a trace. It was a tiny yellow speck in the Central Pacific. Louis Zamperini and his 2 comrades, pilot Russell Phillips and tail gunner Francis McNamara, were alive and afloat and aware that they needed a miracle to stay that way very long. Between them, they had 6 bars of chocolate and 6 pints of water.
The first night, and I hate to say this, but the tail gunner panicked, and while we were sleeping, he ate all the chocolate, a ration for 3 of us for a week. So that was all gone.
The water would now be brutally rationed. A sip in the morning, a sip in the evening. But they figured rescue would arrive before the last drop ran out. Sun and sea create delusions.
We thought, sure, pretty soon somebody's going to see us and pick us up.
A week passed. No ships, no planes, no rescue, nothing. Day 10. The water was almost gone, but suddenly a plane was spotted overhead.
This was probably the most emotional exhilaration in our lives. I mean, we were actually 3 grown men. We were crying, tears running down our faces because we knew we'd be rescued. Man, this was great. We'll be eating dinner with the Marines tonight.
The pilot never saw them. There would be no dinner with the Marines.
We went from one extreme to the other, from one extreme of exhilaration to one of fear.
They thought they were alone. That was frightening enough. Terror came when they discovered they were not alone at all.
We were trying to sleep and we felt a big thud in the bottom of the raft. We just froze. We looked out and here we see this great fin going by. And it seemed to be conscious of us, around the raft, slowly around the raft. And then it would go under the raft and thump it. And we gave orders, do not move, don't say a word. We knew that if he had any sense at all he had to do was just bite through the raft and he had all of us.
After 2 nights of dread, the shark disappeared back into the deep. Soon, the men were catching small sharks with their bare hands and eating their livers. Meanwhile, Zamperini was cooking up fantasies.
He's always talking about his Italian meal.
And I'd say, well, you know, when I used to cook spaghetti, yeah, well, how do you cook spaghetti? I'd have to go through the whole menu, you know, what you put in, how long you cook it, making biscuits. And it got to the point where this was like we were eating real food. And it got to the point where Mac and Phil would say, well, wait a minute, how much baking powder did you put in?
We'd just keep him going. What came next, you know, what came next?
So I had to cook breakfast for them every morning, I had to cook lunch for them every afternoon, and dinner every evening, and pretty soon they got really selfish and they wanted brunch.
On the 27th day, the hum of another plane engine stirred their hearts.
Took our mirrors and reflected the sun's rays off the plane. And of course, that brought him right over to us.
And then all of a sudden we heard machine gun firing. I thought, hey, what goes on here? So we looked again. It looked like a B-25, but it had a strange marking on it. It was a red circle.
A red circle, the insignia of the Japanese Imperial Air Force. Zamperini jumped in the water to avoid the strafing. Phillips and McNamara were too weak to tread water, so they stayed in the raft, pretending to be dead.
It's just unbelievable that after 45 minutes of strafing and all those bullet holes that those guys were missed. It's just a miracle.
It took days to pump out all the water and patch up every hole, but McNamara was sinking fast. On the 33rd night of this odyssey, the tail gunner realized his journey was coming to an end.
And he just asked me the question toward evening. You think I'm going to die? That was it. Do you think I'm going to die? And I said, yes, I think you're going to die.
He did not see the next break of day. Zamperini gave the eulogy, and then, just after dawn, he and Phillips slipped McNamara overboard. Now there were 2 men in a raft, as far from salvation as they'd been the day they crashed. 5 weeks had passed. At 2028 Gramercy Street, Torrance, California, the Zamperinis kept up a vigil for their son, even though they'd received a death certificate signed by President Roosevelt. The Torrance airfield had already been named after Louis, and all over Southern California, newspapers mourned the death of one of the fastest men the West Coast had ever produced.
I know my mother was sure that he was still alive. My dad took it like the rest of us. We hoped for the best.
At the Knights of Columbus track meet at Madison Square Garden, they ran the Lou Zamperini Memorial Mile in his memory. And I broadcast that race, the Lou Zamperini Memorial Mile, and I was crying during the race. I had tears in my eyes, and trying to describe the race. Very emotional thing for me.
There were no tears on the raft. There was no water on the raft. It had been 7 days since the last rain.
They were ready to die. 7 days without water. The next day, we see the squall coming towards us. It's not squall yet, it's just a cloud, and all of a sudden we look up, and now it's raining. After the all-night storm, we couldn't sleep, and the next morning, just heavy seas like this, and we're lifted up on a wave, and we're looking, like we look every day, we look for land. And so this, I'm lifted high on the wave, and I see an island.
It's not easy to imagine what goes through a man's mind when he sees land after 47 days on a raft. When they washed ashore on this beach, Zamperini and Phillips were so weak they couldn't walk. They had to crawl on the sand. But they were alive. That was the good news. The bad news? They had drifted 2,000 miles all the way to the Marshall Islands, and they were not alone. The Marshall Islands were a far-flung outpost of the empire ruled from Tokyo, and the welcoming party consisted of Japanese soldiers who dragged the two Americans to their new home. The mood was black in the Marshall Islands that night.
When they first put us in a cell, I just looked down at my knees, the bones and the skin, and I just started crying. Now here I'm an athlete. I remember myself when I was, powerful physical athlete, and now I'm just skin and bone and a skeleton. That's all, and that brought tears to my eyes.
Escape was unthinkable. The Japanese had turned these tropical islands into fortresses, all ready for the Americans they knew would be coming eventually, and not on rafts. Meals were delivered 3 times a day in the form of a rice ball thrown in the dirt. Water was almost as scarce as it had been on the raft, but there was no shortage of companions.
Well, I felt like there were things running around, there was, and it woke me up. I had this rat sitting right up here on my head.
To Zamperini and Phillips, it was Execution Island. 9 Marines had already been beheaded there, and the Japanese let their new prisoners know their turn would come soon.
They took great joy in telling us we were going to be executed, and they'd always go through the motion, the samurai sword and so forth. And so that was frightening. So every morning we woke up expecting, well, this is the day they're going to kill us.
And then the day came, or appeared to. Zamperini and Phillips couldn't see the sun or the trees because they were blindfolded as they were led through the jungle to the officer's courtyard. Here, at what was the headquarters of the commanding officer, a Japanese doctor was waiting for them, a man who saw them not as fellow human beings or even as Yankee prisoners, but as guinea pigs.
And the doctors and his aides are all standing there, and as they injected us, he says, now, and they had a pad and paper. Tell us every feeling you get, exactly when it happens. And then they started shooting this stuff into our veins. I said, now I feel like needle pricks all over my body. And then they kept letting the stuff go in, and I said, now I'm getting dizzy and I'm gonna pass out. And then they stopped.
And then there was news, astonishing news. On their 43rd day of captivity, Zamperini and Phillips were put on a boat heading for Japan. Destination, a POW camp. Zamperini's race against death was just beginning. In September of 1943, Louis Zamperini and Russell Phillips sailed into Tokyo Bay. They were in the belly of the beast. After 6 months, Phillips was transferred to an officers' camp in the south. Zamperini had hoped to join him, But the Japanese had other plans. Zamperini was shipped to Omori, a camp built on this man-made island in Tokyo Bay. It was here that Louis Zamperini encountered the most frightful figure of his life. His name was Mutsuhiro Watanabe. He was only a sergeant, but he was clearly in charge.
Every day for 10 days, he punched me out.
This was the kind of person you'd expect one day to take out his sword and beam you with it. Slice you down the middle, you know.
He could fly into a rage so quickly and hit out at people and froth a bit at the mouth, while he was doing it.
Watanabe spoke some English, so the POWs were afraid to call him any of the things which came to mind. The nickname they chose was the Bird. Wade drew a picture of the bird.
He had a biggish head, strong face.
I couldn't bear to look in his eyes. I even when I was punished, and he said, "Look in my eyes," I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. To me, they were that sadistic.
The Allied prisoners thought the bird was a sadistic psychopath. His Japanese comrades thought he was, well, a sadistic psychopath.
Even among the Japanese, he was disliked. He was hated by all NCO in Omori, Japanese NCO.
Why?
Why? No question. He was so violent.
In late 1944, Japanese officers brought Zamperini into central Tokyo to Radio Japan, and they made him an offer he really couldn't refuse. Knowing that Zamperini had a lot more star power than Tokyo Rose, they asked him to deliver a radio broadcast to the United States.
I wrote it in such a way that if my parents heard it, that they would know it was me.
On November 18, 1944, Radio Japan announced it had a special guest, Louis Zamperini of 2028 Gramercy Street, Torrance, California.
This is your Louis talking. Through the courtesy of the authorities here, I am broadcasting this personal message to you. This will be the first time in 2.5 years that you will have heard my voice. I am here.
The broadcast was heard in Torrance. Gramercy Street was stunned. But Lou's brother down in a Navy base didn't hear about it until the next day.
My roommate had been down, picked up a paper, and running upstairs, Pete, he says, Lou's alive.
A few months later, officers approached Zamperini about making another broadcast, except this time, Japanese hands would write the script. Zamperini refused. His captors threatened to send him to a special punishment camp.
My first thought was, anything is better than going back to the Bird. If I get away from him, I don't care where I go.
53 years ago this week, Zamperini and 8 other prisoners were put on a steam train and sent north. They didn't know where they were going, but at least they were getting away from the clutches of the Bird.
And we see these beautiful snow-covered Alp-type mountains. We went right through Nagano and then went on to Noetsu.
When we arrived, we couldn't believe it. We got out of the station, and there was a big exit round gate from the station. It was full up with snow to the rooftop. Oh, what the hell? How do you walk through this stuff?
The prisoners had arrived at Noetsu, a cold, forbidding place on the Sea of Japan just 40 minutes outside Nagano. They were taken to a camp at the confluence of 2 rivers and ordered to stand at attention.
Well, we just stood there at attention, stood there, probably 10 or 15 minutes. And all of a sudden the door opens up, and out stepped the Bird.
If someone had given me a pistol, then I would have just blown my brains out.
I felt part of the lowest ebb of my life. I just felt, almost like it's useless.
The bestial treatment and brutal weather had already killed 60 Australian prisoners. With Japan slowly starving in 1945, there was hardly any food for the POWs, and now with the bird in command, Zamperini was entering the final stretch of his long marathon. If ever the kid with the fast finish needed a closing kick, he needed it now. One day in April, the bird ordered Zamperini to look after a sickly goat.
He said, if the goat dies, you die. Told everybody in camp, the goat dies, he dies. And the goat died.
And instead of some usual kind of punishment, he said, pick up that piece of wood. He pointed to a 4x4 by 6 feet and made Sam hold it above his head and just hold it there and said, wait. And then he went and sat on the roof of a little adjoining building, very low roof, you know, sat him there in the sunshine, talking to friends, you know, great fun.
For the first 3 minutes, I could hardly take it. Then I kind of went numb. And I was just frozen in that position.
And he was in agony, every muscle strained, his neck, his eyes, his head, his face, you know.
Zamperini, all 90 pounds of him, wouldn't give in. Finally, driven berserk by the Americans' resilience, the bird came down from the roof and punched him in the stomach. Zamperini collapsed, the 4x4 on top of him. Wade noted the time. Zamperini had been holding that plank for 37 minutes. As the summer of 1945 swung around, the prisoners knew it would be their last summer, and not necessarily because the Americans were winning the war.
Unless we had a crop that we could have reaped, or if our banditry didn't improve, we would have been dead. That's all there was to it.
At the end of that summer of 45, the Japanese told the prisoners to write the letters POW on top of the warehouse. And there was more. They were taken down to this river for the first time to take a bath. They'd barely gotten their feet wet when an American plane appeared overhead, blinking its red light, sending a message in Morse code. The message was, the war is over.
You're well over with emotion and excitement. It's just so much so you feel it's going to explode your body to get out.
The Zamperini family waited for their long-lost son in Long Beach, California, which is not far from Hollywood, and happy endings.
When I saw them and ran up to my parents, my family, I just felt that I'd come back alive. You know, that I'd been dead and I came back alive.
Probably the biggest thrill my folks had ever had. And the caresses and embracing, kissing and the hugging, it was just fantastic. You just came alive with it, just came alive. As a matter of fact, I feel it now.
Louis hopped right into the fast lane trying to catch up with the time he had lost. In 1947, he met Miami debutante Cynthia Applewhite and married her 6 months later. The pace was furious, but he couldn't go the distance. Louis Zamperini could not outrun his past.
Every night, the bird came into my nightmares. No matter what other nightmares I had, he was always in my nightmares. And I was always strangling him with my hands around his throat. He was beating me in prison camp. All I wanted was revenge. When I came home from the war, I thought, if I ever make any money, I'm going to go back to Japan, I'm going to look him up, and I'm going to finish him off.
But the only guy Zamperini was finishing off was himself. He was drinking heavily, taking a dive. His wife urged him to go listen to a young preacher named Billy Graham. One sermon did the trick. Zamperini decided to serve the Lord. How? Go to Japan, spread the word, and face the ghosts.
I was mad, because I was going back to Japan, yet I was thrilled because I was in God's will. So I had the mixed feelings.
At Sugamo Prison, he confronted many of his old guards and confounded them with absolution.
The most important thing in my Christian life was to know that I not only forgave them verbally, but to see them face to face and tell them that I forgave them.
But if Zamperini was finding the answers he needed to go on living, there remained one haunting question.
My only disappointment was when I said, well, where is the bird? I thought he'd be there.
Zamperini wasn't the only one asking that question. Among other men looking for the bird was one General Douglas MacArthur. In 1945, he drew up a list of the 40 most wanted war criminals in Japan. Number 23, Mutsuhiro Watanabe, alias the Bird. MacArthur never found him, neither did anyone else. Right after the war, the Bird flew up to these mountains right above Nagano. He hid out here for 7 years. Zamperini thought he was dead. His mother thought he was dead. She built a shrine for him. But the Bird wasn't dead, and he isn't. This is Mutsuhiro Watanabe, and this is the first televised interview of his life.
ビート、ケックンというのは白人社会においては非常な仕打ちだと。ただ殴ったりピートしたりする程度のものは共同生活の中でやむを得ない場合もあったわけです。
Zamperini and the other prisoners remember you in particular as being the most brutal of all the guards. How do you explain that?
ミリタリーオーダーでやったというんじゃなくて、やはり私自身の気持ちから見てフレンドにはならなかったですね。ザンパリーニさんは有名な人だしあったんだし、彼が渡辺に殴られたというならば、キャンプ内でそういう事実があったことは考えられます。私の立場上。
But Japan didn't remain an enemy of the United States very long, and in 1952, all charges against the Bird were quietly dropped. The man who made so many lives so miserable sold life insurance after the war, became wealthy. Zamperini came back to Japan a few weeks ago, wanted to meet the Bird, but the Bird did not want to meet him. So, Zamperini found another track to his past. There wasn't much question as to who would carry the torch through Naoetsu, the city which was once his prison. Louis Zamperini had no competition. Who could possibly compete with that smile? The 81-year-old ran for a kilometer, didn't set any records, didn't need to. He set those a long time ago.
This was extremely emotional for me to know that there were that kind of people here that would erect such a memorial to prisoners of war. And when I think back to 1945 and when we left Noetsu, it was such a horrible place in our minds, I couldn't look back. But when I leave here today, believe me, I will look back and I will never forget.